I would like to say that I'm very grateful to Professor Fabbrini for asking all the right questions. I think we need this more theoretical debate. I will, however, more speak from a practitioner's point of view, and I think already Roberto Galtieri has started doing that as well. My first remark is that there is sometimes a bit the tendency to do institutional meccano to solve highly political problems. I give one example. When the discussion at the convention was about the foreign policy, a lot of the discussion was predicated on a very Brussels-based and Brussels bubble approach. There is a problem between Solana and the Commission. So we have to create a person which does both and a service which englobes all. Now, it has advantages, I will not go into them, but it has also a certain disadvantages. Because the real issue behind the foreign policy is a different one, actually. It's not one of Brussels mechanics. The real issue is one that there is a discrepancy, there is a gap between what's done nationally, and that's still the major part in foreign relations, and what's done in Brussels. That's a more important one. You don't solve that by institutional meccano. You can also ask questions. I recently talked to a good friend in the EAS. He thought, and I thought at the time, that the fact that people from the EAS should chair working groups of the Council was a good thing. Both of us today think that it's not such a good idea, because it actually makes it more difficult for the EAS to play the role which the Commission plays in the Council. The Commission doesn't chair Council working groups, and it's better for the Commission because they are more independent. If you chair, you have to be more balanced. You cannot push your ideas in the same way. It's just an example. So we have to think before we jump to conclusions. And again, I speak as a practitioner. My second remark is, and I think Professor Fabbrini has explained it very brilliantly, the the EU system. We are a union of states and peoples, and that is very important. And the institutional setup which we have is very sui generis. It has a certain logic. And so, again, I do not say never change anything. I'm not an old-fashioned bureaucrat saying you stick to everything. But before you change it and you jump to conclusions, think about the effect of it. Again, I give an example, the Spitzenkandidaten. There are very cogent reasons for it. There are also some reasons where you have to say, be careful. For instance, one of them is if indeed the Commission becomes more government-like and linked to a political majority in the Parliament, the question at least arises as to whether that union will have the same level of confidence from the member states, or whether that Commission can do competition policy, for instance, in the same way as before. It's just a question. I do not want to go into an argument now, is it good or bad. I simply say, when you start playing with the system, you have to think about the effects of what it has. Then comes a point where I must say, but maybe, Professor Fabbrini, it's maybe a lexicology or vocabulary problem. When I read your articles or books, I have a problem with this, and I think Roberto alluded to this. I do not like to speak about an intergovernmental union and what's the other union. I don't know what it means. What we have and what the treaty says, we have one union. Within that union, we have different components. This, by the way, is not new at all. It has happened before. For instance, when we integrated as a second pillar or third pillar foreign policy and the justice and home affairs, we, within the same institutional framework, and we have to keep the same institutional framework, we integrate various components. We are a union of conferred powers. We only have powers at the union level when they have been conferred by the member states in an intergovernmental conference to the union. And that, of course, determines the methodology. And so this, I'm always a bit upset about this sort of stark opposition. Intergovernmental bad, community good. It depends. In trade, I'm a fierce defender of the community method, a fierce defender. And incidentally, if I may say so, the Council is a community institution. I sometimes read that the Council is intergovernmental. It's rubbish. The Council can function as an intergovernmental group in some areas, for instance, CFSP, but the Council is used to be the sole legislative body in the Union. Now we luckily, happily share it with the Parliament, and it actually works very well. So I think we have to be careful. So there is one union with different components, and as Roberto says, the last thing we want is to create, on the basis of this situation, two sets of institutions. That would be a disaster. Why? Because it would prevent actually something from happening, which is happening quite regularly, because things are transferred from the third pillar into the first pillar. What has happened with Schengen? Schengen is today part of the treaty. If you had done a separate institutional framework, it would never have happened. Justice and Home Affairs, a lot of it is now communitarized. So you have to look at things in the right perspective. And if I may say something, there are also, if you simply plug theoretical terms on policies, you sometimes create more problems than you solve. Sometimes I have the impression, if I may say so, to our friends in the Parliament, in the Commission, and even in the Council, you have the impression that, okay, you solve a problem, but it was solved intergovernmentally, so whatever the solution, it's bad. I'm sorry, there are certain things. When you ask for 750 billion, well, together with the IMF money, to solve the problem which we faced from 2008 onwards in the crisis, well, that is basically national money. So you cannot sort of communitarize that like that. It's not in the treaty, it's not foreseen. So you have to be a bit careful. And if I may again give another example, the migration example. I'll be very honest. I think what the Commission proposed in terms of relocation or relocalization, I never know what, relocation, was the right thing. Actually, it was even right, in my view, to say that sooner or later this has to become a community system. I think. But I think it was a tactical error, partially for ideological reasons, to immediately say there will be a relocation scheme and it's compulsory. It made it more difficult to enlist the participation of a certain number of states. Now, you can say those states are wrong. Yes, but without their help, you can't oblige them to take quotas if they don't want to, at this stage where we are in the Union. So again, this sort of artificial thing, we had suggested to say, don't say anything. We have a huge problem on our hands. All the member countries, and that's what the European Council conclusion said at the time, all the European members have to participate, and don't talk about compulsory, non-compulsory. It's irrelevant. So it's another example. That's why I say I speak as a practitioner, where even if I agree with the theoretical approach, if you push it too quickly, too fast, you will actually make things more difficult. Last remark on the question of the system, on the EMU. Again, the EMU is a perfect example of the coexistence of what we call federal elements and confederal elements, because the economic part is more confederal, it's more intergovernmental, although there, I think, cum grano salis, because in the present system, via an intergovernmental treaty, we've given far more powers to the Commission than ever before. So, I mean, again, you have to take it in a nuanced fashion. But, of course, the monetary part of EMU is entirely centralized and federal. And again, just imagine you would create two institutional setups for those various elements. That would be the end of the EMU. A quick word on the European Council. My personal assessment is that without the European Council, the Union would risk breaking up. Now, does that mean that the European Council should do everything? No, of course not. Should the European Council go into legislative things? No, because it's not in the treaty. The European Council should fix the orientations. Now, there is, of course, sometimes a thin line. Why? Because sometimes it so happens on very tricky issues that in the Council, we simply do not manage to get a negotiating mandate. And then we go to the European Council. We've always done this. That doesn't mean, now, of course, I understand that the Parliament says, okay, we are not bound by what the European Council fixes. That I fully respect. But, of course, for the Council, when the European Council has fixed orientations, it's difficult to depart from it. And this is, this is one of the borderline cases. So the European Council, in a way, it has always been, even before being an institution, is at the apex of the community business. But as the Professor Fabbrini said, and I think Roberto Galtieri as well, the European Council is, of course, also the place where national leaders with their national competences meet together in a kind of club. And Luc will certainly talk about that because he's written a fascinating book where he explains all of this. I think the best explanation I have seen in the theoretical sort of world. I think it's extremely important. And the advantage of having the leaders there is that they have a double legitimacy. And again, Professor Fabbrini, I mean, you say legitimacy cannot be transported in a taxi. I don't know whether I completely understood what you said, but what I want to say, let's take Mrs. Merkel. Mrs. Merkel is highly legitimate in Germany, I suppose. I mean, she's the Bundeskanzler. So when she comes to Brussels, to the European Council, she is still very legitimate because she represents her country and it's a major country in the Union. And she brings it in. And all the others bring in their legitimacy. So you do transport legitimacy with you. Now, you can, of course, say that result of the sort of 28 legitimacies, you can ask a question about that, and I think that's what you do when you propose a sort of parliamentary control of that. But the legitimacy is definitely there, and the advantage is when you have a problem like migration, or you have a problem of environment, for instance, where you have some elements of community competence, and a lot of elements which are national competences, it's very important that you're able to bring them all in. I remember European Council, we talked about environment, and we talked about billions which had to be mobilized to help the third world countries to engage in this, to embark on this policy. And there they suddenly sort of became a kind of intergovernmental group where they said, I put so much, you put so much, I put so much. We could not use the community budget because it was too small for that and it was not foreseen. So, I mean, I think we should stop this constant sort of opposition between styles. And I would also say this constant thing, has the European Parliament won? Is the European Council thing? I mean, I think it's a bit sterile, actually. Last remark, because I think I should stop. One of the things we are facing presently is a streak of crises. And of course, the way we handle the crisis, that clouds, that colors the reactions to the European Union. Now, it is true, we are a formidable organization. We still are, in terms of structurally changing the world. The legislative process, it's complicated, it works brilliantly, works better than the American system. And the co-decision with Parliament, I think it's really a success story, and we should say so. Now, it's a different matter when we move to the crisis management. Why? Because crisis management needs chain of command. We don't have a chain of command. It needs quick reactions, very difficult to do at 28, and the institutions. It needs executive powers, because you have to do things and so. So naturally, the only place, the things which gets closest, now don't misunderstand me, but the things which gets closest to a kind of collective government is the European Council, and that's why quite naturally, and that will not change. When you have a crisis like migration, you have a crisis like the financial crisis, inevitably the center player will be the European Council. That is just a fact, it will not change. So I think I'll stop here. I'll just make a last remark. So I think what we need in Europe is more of a theoretical debate, and I, again, think the books are very interesting and very useful to do that. But what we also should do more, what the Americans do better, is to link the theoretical underpinning of the discussion about the future of Europe with the practical side and the practitioners. There is too much of a divide in Europe between the practitioners and the theoreticians or the things. And it's something which has always struck me. Of course, in the United States, you have the system, the spoil system, so you have many people sitting in think tanks who have been in business, who have been in administration, in government, and you have vice versa. You have people in the government who have actually had the time to think and to have a theoretical underpinning to their work. So I think there's something in Europe we should probably try to bridge this gap a bit more. Thank you very much.